You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. The term Deathrock was first used in the 60s in popular culture to describe songs about teenage death. In the late 70s and early 80s, terms other than Deathrock were first used to describe bands like 45 Grave, the Superheroines, Castration Squad. Terms like ghouls, new wavers, gloomers, horror punk, and so on were used to describe the scene before the term Deathrock was popularized. The term Deathrock first saw wider use around 81-82, popping up in interviews with people like Roz Williams, showing up on promotional flyers, and just in general scene discourse. It's also worth noting there's a line from the Misfits song, All Hell Breaks Loose, in 81 that says, broken bodies in a Deathrock dance hall. Sprung up from the primordial soup of LA subculture, Deathrock was largely the love child of glam and punk artists like Lou Reed, Nick Cave, Iggy Pop, Bowie, Roxy Music, The Screamers, Alice Cooper, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, The Damned, The Germs, Adam and the Ants, Public Image Limited, T-Rex, and a whole slew of local bands you'd kind of have to have been around in LA at the time to have ever heard of. Along with a bunch of B-horror films like Hammer Horror or vampire films, all taking place under Reaganism, when the ennui of almost certain nuclear annihilation was palpable. Though that's not to imply Deathrock was birthed whole cloth from the LA scene, no matter how much only Theater of Pain fans want to imply that's the case. 13th Chime, Johnny Melton, Rudimentary Peni, Madame Edwards, Fadia, Paralysis Permiente, and others from around the world developed their own Deathrock sound and style and had a very large influence on what we know of as Deathrock today. As it's known today, Deathrock is kind of the theater kid version of goth. It's either more schlocky and dramatic and outspoken and carnivalesque, or it's the gutter punk of the goth scene, grimy, slimy, and wearing the same unwashed pair of patch pants from 10 years ago. Deathrock also exemplifies the type of hardcore goth who has encyclopedic knowledge of the music of the last 40 years, at least in my experience. Still, much like goth, the qualification of what is and isn't Deathrock varies from person to person, even with the fashion often being the most obvious and agreed upon distinction of the genre. In recent years, the explosion of goth bands has been going on for some time now. Post-punk had a big resurgence early on. A few years ago, darkwave gained dominance for a while. Right now, I think there's a great variety of all kinds of dark music being made, but I am hearing more and more about folks looking for Deathrock. So in this episode, I endeavored to bring together a group of people from within that scene to talk about many of these issues. On our episode last month, I teased the guests who would be on. Adrya of Tears for the Dying. She's been making music for nearly 20 years at this point and has gotten a lot more popularity in the last couple years as well. She has a fantastic new single out, and her last full length called Memories and was just released last year. Kent is the guitarist of the band Alter de Fe, a Deathrock band who formed in the San Francisco area in the early 80s, played shows for a few years, and then kind of disappeared until recently. Alter de Fe takes their name from the Vincent Price record about witchcraft and demonology, in which Alter de Fe is a reference to the public penance of heretics, where they would be burned and tortured at the stake. They returned to the scene in 2016 with their release of Echo in the Corridor and have been putting out music ever since. I also mentioned that we would have 2 additional guests, 3 actually. Oliver, who is a journalist and has written in the past about the history of the death rock scene. I'll link his work along with Alter de Fe and Tears for the Dying in the show notes, and also Die of All Strain, both members of the non-binary feminist Chilean band, were meant to be on today's episode, and unfortunately, both of them had to, that being Die of All Strain and Oliver, cancel at the last minute due to schedule conflicts that were not really their fault. So they won't be joining us, but we will be having Adrya of Tears for the Dying and Kent of Alter de Fe here to speak with us about their experiences being in the death rock scene and to take a little trip through the years of death rock music. It's difficult to define what death rock is, even though a lot of people think they know the sound when they hear it. The music of 81 to 86 or 87 itself is a melting pot of chaotic sounds, similar to the goth movement. Bands like 45 Grave, TSOL, Pompeii 99, The Decadent, Screams for Tina, Nervous Gender. I mean, the list goes on and on. These bands share something in common, but run the gamut of sound and influence. Likewise, death rock of the following eras, from Community FK and Osgang to Tragic Black, Bloody Dead and Sexy, Plastique Noir, Eat Your Makeup, Black Ice in the 2000s, Black Heroin Gallery, Red Wing Blackbird, Mescaline Babies of the early 2010s, and now bands like Shrouds, Witch Hands, Crimson Scarlet, Malefixo, Pawns, Cemetery, Detoxy, Totenwald, The Creeping Terrors. These bands all in some way carry on the legacy of death rock, and yet can be polarizing, be considered completely unrelated to the genre of death rock, or be considered the exemplary death rock band. So I want to try and unpack some of this on today's episode with our guests and hear about the way death rock has impacted their music, their lifestyle, their community, and their identity. Kent, if we can start with you, I kind of want to ask about, well, yeah, just to hear how you started getting into music, how you started getting into the scene, and if you can kind of share from your perspective a bit about what was going on at the time, what the community was like, what the influences were, what people were into, that kind of thing.
Starting music, my brother had a band when I was, we were in practice in the house, and they left all their equipment around, and, I had a chance to bang around on drums and guitars and what was going on. And my brother gave me an amp, and I bought a guitar and started playing around with that, and eventually worked on playing in punk rock bands with friends in high school, and that eventually morphed into Alter de Fe in San Francisco at the same time. And that was probably around 83, 84 or so. Mm-hmm. But the scene was, pretty small. There was a handful of, groups that played around there at the time. Nothing Sacred we played with, Lady of Pain, Ages of Sin, but a little bit coming up to that, you know, in the early 80s, you know, the influences are, you know, Bauhaus and Christian Death were probably my turning points in seeing them live. I was really exposed to a lot of live music growing up in Marin and San Francisco, getting to see a lot of bands in small clubs, which really inspired me. And that's kind of how I learned to play music, kind of. I had an odd way of, I'm more of a visual learner and playing music, so that's kind of an odd style I have. Yeah, there's only a few clubs to play at, Mabuhay and a few places on Haight Street. And so,
were those bands coming to San Francisco to play, or were you driving somewhere else to go see them?
They were all playing in San Francisco.
Okay.
I think Bauhaus played, it was 1981 or something. They played the Old Waldorf, and pretty amazing. And there wasn't a whole lot of people there, which was odd. But yeah, I was really blown away by them. And they actually played the next night in Berkeley. I went to that like that Thursday night. There was like 7 people there.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I was working in LA for a summer, and I went to Al's Bar and happened to, I can't remember the headline. It was either like Savage Republic or Tragic Mulatto. And playing right before them was this band, Christian Death, that I'd never heard of. Pretty different, you know. Bronze Williams on stage and all the clothing and face paints.
So then a lot of the music you guys were making, were you mostly just gigging essentially? Because it seems like a lot of the music then was brought about as sort of the only outlet that kids had to kind of express themselves, I guess, rather than like, oh, we're going to make music because we want to make an album and we want to, share.
Yeah, that wasn't really the focus of, like we only recorded 4 songs, but
right.
It's more about just playing music and playing out, playing house parties, their houses if we could. An outlet to have some fun.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about the your style then, because I've seen some of the photos from that time. Where were you guys pulling inspiration for your aesthetic from, I guess?
Well, probably obviously all the bands I've been talking about, but we just, it was all about big hair and paint face and some wild clothing and.
It's like some glam inspiration.
Yeah. Outrageous. Yeah, I mean, there was the hair bands before that.
What were you listening to growing up?
Probably a lot of regular rock and roll and stuff.
I know it's hard to remember. Like, I don't know if I could remember.
I can't even remember what I was listening to. All the, Black Sabbath and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that first Black Sabbath album, a lot of people talk about that having an inspiration or being an inspiration for music that came after it,
Deep Purple and stuff. And it's kind of all over the place.
Yeah. Because I wonder how much of that. Well, you know what? I'll get to DIY in a minute. I'll hold that off for a second. Adrya, let me ask you, what was when did specifically 80s death rock and goth and alternative music come into your life, and how did that influence you?
I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian household, so I was not exposed to anything other than Amy Grant and whatever other Christian rock was being passed around the house at the time. And sometimes you could sneak and listen to Top 40 radio. By the late 80s, I finally moved out on my own and started getting exposed to the local music scene here. And one of the very first concerts I went to see was a local band here, an industrial band called Nerve Clinic. They played a tiny hole-in-the-wall club here, and they're completely dark. There are no lights other than just the LEDs on the instruments and whatnot on stage. They had 3 TV sets set up, and each of the TV sets had these montage, these like homemade video recordings of just brutality, of people being burned at the stake, people having their tongues cut out, so on, just really gruesome stuff. And like behind that, you have this wall of sound of electronic drum machines and really loud guitars, and droning vocals. That was my first exposure to live dark music, and I was hooked. I loved it. So that was about 1989 or so. A couple years later, some friends of mine talked to me about joining a band they were forming. Nobody had played any instruments before, so I agreed to do that. Got a guitar from a coworker at my pizza place, and we started practicing together. We were terrible, but it was fun. So about a year and a half or so later, I was starting to write songs for the band, and the bassist commented that my songs were very dark. And he says, are you influenced by Bauhaus and Christian Death? And I says, I don't know who either of those bands are. And so he says, well, you're coming over to my house next week, and we're going to listen to records. And so went over, got some wine and beer, and we sat down and listened to Only Theater Pain for the very first time. And I was fucking blown away. It was a spiritual moment for me to hear that music on vinyl that night. Listen to 45 Graves, Autopsy, Sleep with Safety. Introduced me to plasmatics as well. But I was overwhelmed that this music existed, and I kind of found my calling.
Yeah. I do want to get into like the substance of the music, but maybe it would be good to do a little callback to your first introduction with that imagery going on on the projector at that show, because one of the things I wanted to ask about is, I guess this does relate to musical substance. Just one aspect of it is that shock value that kind of runs through Deathrock to one degree or another, where, you mentioned 45 Grave, that's like on one spectrum or one side of the spectrum, where you have the kind of horror film schlock, and then at the other end you have Roz and Ron Athey crucifying and disemboweling a dead cat at premature ejaculation shows. So that shock value, I think, has always been more relevant to Deathrock than Goth. So I wanted to ask what your opinion was on the role that shock plays in Deathrock, and maybe like how that's changed over the years.
Oh, like definitely, I feel like the surprise of I was drawn in. It was just overwhelming. Like just the music was, but having those displays up there on stage and watching the horrific scenes of a lady being tied at a stake and kindling being placed around her, and then the fire, and you see the flames engulfing her. That definitely added a lot to the experience for me. Like I don't know that I would have come away feeling as I did had they not had those video visuals on stage. Like I don't think it'd be the same. I think I would have been very impressed by just having the drum machine and the loud guitars, but I think the other part really helped seal the deal for me.
Was it what was it about that? Was it just at the transgression of it, or was it representative of something deeper than that? Or
it was all brand new to me. Mind you that I think I did sneak out to see Friday the 13th in the 1980s, but I did not get an opportunity to I wasn't exposed to really anything interesting in the 80s. So this was all brand new to me on so many levels.
Right. Well, what about you, Kent? How do you see like the role of shock in Deathrock?
I don't know if it's so much shock, but the theatrics of stage stuff, performance, and visuals, an interesting aspect.
Yeah.
My project today, we don't have shock stuff going on. I mean, like once in a while at a show we'll do something interesting, but that's not what I'm about. I'm more focused on the music and, as Kent said, the theatrics. And I feel like today, and maybe it's just because I'm 30 years older than I was back then, but like I guess maybe Marilyn Manson had a lot to do with just turning me off to just straight up shock rock.
Mm-hmm.
And today I'm a little less receptive to just straight out shock value and death rock. Like, I know it has its place. I'm not offended by it, but like, I'm more interested in just the darker romantic element of the scene in music. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me too, that the way I view shock has changed obviously over the years from being a kid, where it was more about, I want to see the violence and the gore and like get that, as extreme as possible because it's taboo. Whereas now, I guess I'd probably mark a difference between being shocking for just for the sake of being edgy, or being shocking to make some sort of artistic or political statement, or kind of what you're saying. There's the theatricality, and I think kind of in a more goth sense, the sort of expression of the existential horror of being in a human body kind of thing. And I think people still talk about this today, right? People talk about Susie wearing a swastika, or Roz using swastikas in multiple places, or even actually just recently there was that interview with unrelated, but Glenn Danzig talking about how, you can never make music like I did today because of cancel culture. People are too sensitive or whatever. Which I think is more of the idea of punching up instead of punching down. Like if you're just being shocking to be shocking, you can end up going back to Manson. You're just romanticizing sexual abuse and rape culture, which is hurting people that are in your own scene. So I think death rock has kind of, and goth in general, I mean, society has changed over the years, but it's become more about having a meaning to it. I guess in the 80s LA death rock scene, there was some tangential to that was the performance art scene. Like Johanna Wendt, and obviously Ron Athey did a bunch of extreme stuff. But as he developed as a person, his art became more about like, he did a lot of shocking performance art to make a point about like the fear of AIDS and that kind of thing. I mean, and death rock is more of a like cousin of punk anyway, right? So it has the more of a freedom to do that kind of really in your face.
Yeah, it can be a little aggressive.
For me, the issue with shock in general, and I had a similar experience with most of you, where it was something that was alluring early on. I was like, oh wow, this is new, this is different. But it's sort of a blunt instrument, supposedly meant to wake the masses up from their torpor to listen to a message. That message doesn't always follow. Sometimes it's just about the shock. And unfortunately, as you continue to use shock, your audience becomes more and more inured to it. So you have to keep upping the ante. And frankly, shock in music and in performance art has been going strong since the early 1900s. And at this point, the sheer amount of stuff you have to do to up the ante is it's ridiculous and almost untenable. So it's lost a lot of its value. It's lost a lot of its teeth. And so it doesn't really break people out of that torpor anymore. It can get the attention of, people just getting into music because they haven't seen the whole history of it. But anybody who's been paying attention to music for any amount of time has seen it. So what bands have to do to top that is it's bordering on parody at this point. And it's just lost everything.
I think maybe there's also the Catholicism is an interesting thing as well, relating to death rock. I mean, obviously you have Christian death, but Nervous Gender, for example, because we had Edward on our show before. But even Roz and like Rick Agnew, and they were kids like you, Adrya, who grew up in a very conservative environment, and so making music as kids at the time, part of that was just kind of the rebellion against the damage of religion. But I think Catholicism is also just a great well to draw from anyway, because there's the ritualistic nature and all the base themes of death and sexuality and brutality and this really intricate aesthetic, like gaudy aesthetic that you can pull from. I don't know if there's as much religious commentary now in Deathrock, but it was definitely a big thing at the time.
I mean, yeah, I think religion in general is fading.
Yeah.
And that's maybe why.
That's a good point. Yeah. So let's talk, since I'm rambling about aesthetic here, let's talk a little bit about DIY from a different angle, because obviously, well, let me just ask this. How was DIY valuable to you as a person and in your music? And how relevant do you think that is today to the scene? And maybe Kent, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, the DIY scene is, quite important and much more interesting to me than the mainstream trying to go bigger. I've run a warehouse for the last 15 years. I really enjoyed that community much better than trying to play. Yeah, it's a lot more community oriented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you feel like that's still as relevant to what you're doing now as it was when you first started making music?
Yeah, I think it's probably more evolved now. I think it's so much more accessible.
I mean, how do you go about like deciding if you want, like, how you're going to produce an album, or if you're going to join a label, or do you run that through a kind of DIY ethos?
Yeah, I mean, all of our albums have been released through smaller labels, just more personal.
Right. Yeah.
I think DIY is the new mainstream. Like, I don't think mainstream music today sucks. It's all algorithm based. We all know this. Like, what chord progressions are going to make the most amount of money, and I just don't think nobody listens to that music that means anything. Like, when was the last time like dark music was mainstream? And I would have to go back probably to the 90s, and as much as we just talked about him earlier, Marilyn Manson, maybe Nine Inch Nails to a degree, but like today, dark music is far from being part of the mainstream. DIY is important for me because I'm not rich. I don't live in poverty. Like, I'm definitely lower class, and I feel that includes a lot of us. And for those in the lower class, working class people, DIY is our only option.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just evolved. And, if you look around today, we were just talking before we got on the show of how much new music there is and how much really awesome new music in all these different genres and subgenres. And, all this music is DIY. Everyone now literally can get a DAW for pretty cheap and a couple microphones and record in their bedroom, their dance studio, practice space, bump some stuff up the Bandcamp, DistroKid that stuff out the Spotify, and you're right there in the same level with New Order and Susie and whatever else people listen to today, of dark music.
Right. Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good point. Bandcamp and that kind of thing. Kent, how were you sharing and finding music when you were getting into, creating music?
Biggest thing was like local radio, non-commercial radio. There was, growing up, I had one commercial-free radio right by us, which was great. And then San Francisco had KUSF, KFJC here that you could get sometimes. And that's probably where I found a lot of the underground music.
Did you have any local record shops that you could go to?
Yeah, there was quite a few used record shops around, and you could go in there and file through the and you would find new stuff. And, yeah, there's one, Rough Trade Records was in San Francisco. That was a great place to find new music. You could go there, and they would have all the newer 45s and 12 inches from England, Sisters of Mercy,
right?
Stuff that you didn't really hear on the radio yet.
Yeah. Did they play any of that stuff on like college radio, or was it still? I mean, I know Sisters obviously at some point was on the radio, but like, you know, the punk music, or even, you know, Christian Death, or whoever, you know, smaller.
Yeah, they did. KUSF in San Francisco did a lot of that stuff.
That's amazing. I mean, I guess it's not surprising because you couldn't just go online and stream whatever you wanted. But it's hard to imagine hearing that kind of thing on the radio now.
Yeah, it's, you know, I guess the certain DJs would find that stuff. You know.
Right. Yeah.
Everyone was a little different, so you know, there was black metal outlets and hard rock, more punk stuff coming out.
Yeah.
That was that was the best outlet. Hearing new stuff.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts are DIY. I do think DIY is really important. Obviously, artists are going to have more control over their art and have more creative control, I guess, which is important. And there's definitely that community aspect, which I think is the most important part of DIY. That sort of, actually, maybe First Church of the Buzzard might be a good example. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but just from the outside, it seems like that's really kind of channeling that punk rock commune ethos, where it's like this art collective creation space. But it's still, because it is a community, you're still cultivating like specific social ideologies and norms, I guess, expectations about the community, which I think has a big impact on this, a social impact that DIY has, I think.
Yeah, that's base came about, you know, to make art with a bunch of friends, and kind of we all played music, so we started doing smaller shows, and it's just kind of evolved from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the fashion side of that, you know, as a goth, I have to talk about the fashion. But actually, funny, I was thinking about this the other day. We had a guest on last year who said that she argued that the New Romantics basically came into existence because that was the fashion that was showing up in the warehouses, like secondhand shops, and that just became the new like youth movement because that's what you could get in thrift stores. And I guess in LA it was kind of a similar thing where you had old Hollywood costumes and like the gaudy jewelry and the black dresses from the 20s and rosaries and that kind of thing. Yeah, but it's interesting though, because I don't know if either of you have thoughts on this, but there was a lot of criticism of death rock fashion in the 2000s, I guess, early 2000s, kind of when you had my point of reference is Razor Candy, who was a model, and she kind of exemplified that style. But I heard a lot of goths complaining about how cookie cutter death rock style was, which honestly is kind of, I think, maybe the pot calling the kettle black. But Adrya, I don't know if you're a very stylish person. Do you have any thoughts about fashion and DIY and death rock?
Wow. I don't know how to take that. Thank you. Fashion is a mouthful. The monster movies, like I feel that dark goth death rock fashion pretty much was stolen from, and even going back before the 50s monster movies, 60s and whatever, the silent films, the actors and actresses would, pile on dark makeup and just accentuate the eyes and whatever. And that kind of was adopted on, by goths and death rockers in the 80s, probably in the 70s. I mean, Patricia Morrison obviously, had that look going on early on before anybody else did. And I mean, punks did add more spice and color to it as time went on. Like, I mean, I don't have a problem with people, dressing stereotypically goth. I have no problems with it because, like, literally most people, like, on the world do not dress that way. Like, we are a statistical minority. Like, and so the fact that somebody appreciates, dark fashion, I love it. A little suspicious of the idea that, like, people who wear black leather jackets and black lipstick, wearing a uniform, and that they're all clones. Like, I'm kind of suspicious of that notion.
Yeah.
It seems counter to the DIY ethic and letting people choose for themselves how they want to appear. Like, I'm not in favor of controlling people and, like, hey, you should, like, dress this way or that way. Do what you got to do. But, like, we were talking about thrift stores earlier. I remember, like, that was a big part of my life, in the late 80s and early 90s. And that was pretty much where I got all my clothes from.
Mm-hmm.
I would go and find cool shit in thrifts, and sometimes I would rip it up to make it look better. I don't know, like, over the last few years, I've dipped in some thrift stores, and just, like, clothing is not the same as what I remember it to be back in the 90s. I feel like today, like, you can almost do better just literally going on to, to eBay or whatever, and, like, just getting some really cheap shit. And I mean, it's fucking capitalism and it sucks, but, like, I feel like dark fashion is more accessible to people and it's more affordable.
Well, if you're in a big city too, I mean, you're gonna, in LA or Chicago or somewhere, you're obviously gonna have a better time thrifting clothing. But yeah, that reminded me what you said. That made me think of Theda Bara, the actress who a lot of the aesthetic from the 80s kind of took inspiration from those, like, German expressionist films and that really dramatic lighting and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the monster movies, like you said. So let's talk maybe a little about the 2000s and the musical landscape. Adrya, I know you started releasing music in the early 2000s. What were you into at the time? What was the death rock scene part of your life? Was it more goth stuff? What was inspiring you to make music? What was your community like at the time?
For sure, yeah. So, like, I kind of, like, by the, like, mid 90s or so, I got out of playing, like, death rock and started playing in an indie pop band, completely different genre. Late 90s or so, I discovered this new band to me, Cinema Strange, and I had a similar reaction to when I first heard Only Theater Pain. I was like, well, this is pretty interesting stuff. It's not quite 80s. It's got its own thing going on, and I felt very inspired. So I started writing more music for my then solo project, bedroom band Tears. Back in the early 2000s, there was a forum on deathrock.com. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, so that was where a lot of us hung out. We shared music, and of course, in the early 2000s, we had up in New York City, there's Drop Dead 1, 2, and 3. I went to all three of those and just had just an amazing time. I felt like the scene in the early 2000s was just thriving. Like, just there was so much good energy in music back then. I don't know. People have a different take on it. I feel like it was a really good time for death rock in the early 2000s.
I mean, at one point they were labeling it the death rock revival, where it was this sort of, I guess, after the 80s into the 90s, a lot of people's lives kind of got destroyed by drugs, but also a lot of bands just broke up. And then in the 90s, there was really that electronic side of goth started taking over, and people that were more into guitar-based music were just like, okay, I've had enough of this shit, and started making music. And I mean, the Deathrock revival was really kind of an international thing. Our guest last month in Germany was talking about how huge that was in the early 2000s. And, you know, people were calling themselves Batcavers, and in Germany, that was just a big, everybody was spinning death rock and goth rock.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Kent, were you at a different point in your life at that time? Did you take notice of the music that was coming out then?
Yeah, by the 2000s, I had kind of shifted a little bit.
Yeah.
Industrial music was coming out, Ministry, Crash Worship.
Mm.
So I was getting more into experimental music at that point. I was making analog synthesizers, and
Very
making
cool.
costumes, doing performance art. Two of us that played together. We made analog synthesizers. It's called Omnivorous Synthsilum. We make spider costumes and play analog.
Hell yeah.
Electronics and project our music over oscilloscopes. So it still had a nice visual element.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been working off and on with the SRL, Survival Research Laboratories. So performance art was pretty big thing. So I really wasn't into death rock that much right then. I can even know that there's any good death rock bands come out in the 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, Trey, that's actually sounds more like what you would be into.
Oh yeah, definitely more into the experimental side rather than straight up punk and death rock. Sort of the traditional rock band side of things has not really been my focus. But yeah, noodling with synthesizers and weird things and banging on stuff is always much more my jam.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, there were definitely some good bands at the time. Anti-World and Scarlet Remains, Novocaine Mausoleum. But I think there were also some actually, I think in a piece Oliver wrote, he talked about it being a bit cartoony. With like, at least for me, like bands like Tragic Black and All Gone Dead.
Tragic Black, they seem to be fairly polarizing from what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
I take it like this. I listen to Tragic Black's records today, and I feel they were innovators. They started pushing the music in a direction that other bands hadn't gone yet. They were introducing a lot of electronic music. Their music was very busy. They had a lot of layers to it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people they were saying, oh, they're a clone of Cinema Strange, and they really weren't. And yeah, I feel they were pushing the music forward. And we'll talk more of music today, but like, yeah, I have no problems with Tragic Black. I kind of like them. I didn't like them as much back then, but when I started listening to some of their stuff lately, I'm just realizing how good they were.
Yeah, I guess just not my thing, but that's fine. That's totally fine. Well, maybe we can talk a little about music today then, because I mean, honestly, the 90s and 2000s, you know, I could throw some bands out there, but I'm not super familiar with the music at that time, or the death rock at least. And it wasn't really a big part of my life. I mean, it was all over the internet as far as the style was concerned. But I think from my perspective at the time, it had become more of a fashion than a musical aspect of the like underground culture that I was in. And then that may have just been my own experience, but I also at the time was more into electronic music anyway, so it wasn't a huge thing for me personally. But I am interested to hear, well, maybe Kent, I can ask you this, because you obviously Alter de Fate kind of had a big comeback from well, if I want to be cheesy, I could say Back from the Grave. But I'm interested to hear how that kind of went for you, sort of getting back into that specific band and how that was received, and if it was surprising or if it was, what that experience was like.
Yeah, it was quite surprising to me. I hadn't really thought about playing that type of music until there was a reunion that happened 2011. It was kind of just a get together for all the people that used to live in that era. Turned into bands playing, and they wanted us to play. So we did that, and then came off pretty well, and kind of surprised. And so we continued on, and it's just built up ever since, and it's been quite pleasurable.
Yeah.
Write some new music and play this old stuff, and people are still digging it.
Do you? I don't know if you have any sense of this, but do you find the audience is more people who were into that music in the 80s, or do you have like a whole fresh audience?
Yeah, it kind of runs the whole gamut. I mean, there's a lot of new people crowd. There's still a lot of the older folks from that time still around.
Yeah. Yeah, because I remember when we talked with Edward of Nervous Gender, he was saying that he was surprised that he had these young people coming up to him and telling him about the 80s scene and telling him stories that he didn't even remember. And he was just surprised like how knowledgeable these young kids were about, and how interested they were in like the 80s, scene. Adrya, let me ask you this then, because obviously Alter de Fey had a big comeback. I know 1919 and like 13th Chime are still making music and kind of had a similar comeback in a way, but it seems like with Deathrock, even maybe more so than Goth, Deathrock fans are kind of obsessed with the 80s. So I wonder if it's harder to find an audience and like get people interested in your music if you weren't making music in the 80s.
I don't think I don't know. Maybe that's true. With regard to like expectations today and like how that affects me and my creative process, like I'm aware, like, everyone loves the classic 80s sound, and perhaps that's more accessible, to a degree. And there's a lot of modern, younger kids who like hate Only Theater Pain. Like it's too weird, and it's and there's people today, a lot of people who still really love that jangly Cure post-punk sound, and it's a good sound. Some friends of mine here in Athens have a band called Vision Video. Dusty Gannon is the singer and guitar player for that band, and they are amazing. They're going to go far, rightfully so. They're really great musicians. For me, I just like to write music that sounds good to me, and not necessarily what I feel that people are necessarily wanting to hear.
Yeah, I think that was maybe one of the things I was going to ask both of you is, I guess because this is a goth talk podcast, I have to kind of ask the classification questions. And obviously when we're talking about music, there's that stereotypical version of a goth that's super knowledgeable and really strict in their genre classifications and spends a lot of time arguing about what is or isn't goth. And so historically, there's kind of this tension between artists wanting to just be creative and then goths wanting to put a tag on everything. And so it's like, well, do you call your music dark punk, or is it death rock, or do you just say, I just want to do what I want to do? How do you, label or define death rock? How do you define your own music? Does it even matter to you?
Yeah, it does in a sense, because I mean, I do want my music to be appreciated. I want people to listen to it. And it kind of matters to make sure you do give points of reference for people to know how to find you. I view death rock as more of an umbrella genre. And maybe death rock is a subgenre of rock music and punk and all that. But like death rock, we have bands. We talked about Tragic Black. We didn't talk about. There's a modern band called Lilac Web that I feel are very similar to Tragic Black and the way they're mixing anarcho-punk with electronic music. And there's that side of death rock, and there's more of a classic rock style of death rock. We mentioned New Skeletal Faces before the show. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different subgenres within death rock. When I put my stuff out and tag it on Bandcamp, I usually add words like death rock, goth, post-punk. Usually people can find us pretty well with those tags.
Yeah, I was just going to ask whether the rise of these services with tagging as a primary categorization feature is really pushing the feel that you need to kind of classify things more than maybe you would have in the past.
I mean, it doesn't change how I write. Like, one of the things that I kind of like to do in my project is like I don't particularly like to write an album of 6, 7, 8 songs that all basically the same song in different keys. Like I want to have an album that has just a little variety on it. It's still gonna be dark music, but like it's gonna have some variety. Like might be some more ethereal post-punk stuff on there and some harder political punk rock. That's just kind of where my heart is and where my creative drive is. I'm not sure how to categorize that as a whole, other than just to say it's death rock.
Yeah, I'm not really so strict on the category of writing and say so much of death rock. I write what appeals to me. Then we bring the band, and that's where it gets created into death rock.
Right.
Wanting to create a band, an album that's not every song is the same, and I strive to do that. Same beat.
Yeah, right.
So a lot of stuff that gets thrown out. It sounds too similar. And, stuff.
Right. I mean, on that note, do you? Because I mean, some musicians will say that they really don't listen to music in the scene or music that's similar. Because they don't want to be influenced by it, and some musicians are really into, paying attention to what's going on. Do you care about trying to connect to that sphere of music, or is it less important to you?
Being influenced by it, I try not to be influenced by everything. I mean, you're obviously being influenced by stuff here, but you don't want to stay in that same pattern.
Are you mostly listening to music outside of like the kind of music that you play?
Yeah, I listen to a wide gamut.
Yeah.
Rock, black metal,
definitely like to listen to modern music. I kind of had a crisis in the 2010s of like only listening to classics, whether that be 80s music or goth music or whatever. And I got so burned out and sick of listening to it. My mindset changed. I decided I didn't want to listen to old stuff anymore. I didn't want to listen to new, what was being created today. What are the kids talking about today? So I do listen to modern post-punk and some death rock, not as much as maybe I ought to, but like I do listen to like other genres, some electronic music. I listen to indie rock, dream pop. I love beach house, but also I love going back and I'll pick an artist. Sometimes something will come to me and like, this sounds kind of interesting. And of all things, Hall & Oates recently popped up on my periphery, and I've been kind of going back to their back catalog, and not necessarily their 80s stuff, but things they wrote back in the 70s. and it's just interesting to listen to. And music like that isn't written today, so it's another point of reference. I just like listening to new music, and it may be stuff that was written before that I never listened to. But
right.
Yeah, I haven't listened to like Sisters of Mercy. I rarely listen to the classic death rock stuff. Honestly, we did cover a Christian death song a couple years ago, and I think that'll be the last time I'm able to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of, from my perspective, part of what makes both of your bands interesting to me, where Adrya, your new single had strings in it, and one of the tracks off the new Alter de Fe EP, there's, at least from my completely untrained ear, sounded like there was some like surf rock influence on it, which I think, if you look at the 80s and the music that was being created in the scene then, there were those influences, like it sort of, that were more in the scene and sort of the proto, punk anarcho goth stuff. But there was also like people were listening to, I don't know, Lou Reed and Roxy Music,
right,
and
a lot of reggae.
T-Rex, reggae, right? So I think that the best bands have those external influences that kind of come in, whether that's conscious or not, rather than just being like straight down the line, kind of everything, something that you've heard a million times before.
Right.
Which actually, that's, going back to the labeling thing. I don't know, we talked about the death rock revival, and some people have said that what we have right now is a post-punk revival, and maybe neither of you give a shit about this, but as far as like using the term revival, is that how you kind of classify what's happening right now? Or do you, like, I know William Faith, I talked to him and he hates that word. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, just like sort of how we culturally identify what's happening in the music sphere.
See it as more of a revival. It's more of a progression moving forward. Everything gets melded up the same, and different genres mix and evolve into new stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm not used the word before. I definitely used it to describe like the scene that happened in the early 2000s, because I felt that that was genuine. Like there was actually some new shit coming out that had been kind of dormant. I feel that people using it today, like it's basically every new generation's dark music is going to be a revival of death rock. I don't know. I'm conflicted on whether that's something we should be doing anymore. Maybe we should find another word for it and describe it differently somehow. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think revival, well, I don't know. It can sound too much like we're doing the thing that somebody already did. Like the way that I kind of see the music of the last few years has really been, I mean, obviously I wasn't around in the 80s, but it feels like as close as we can get to that explosion of originality and creativity of the 80s, and like the community involvement and passion in this sort of post-punk and dark wave and goth rock and now death rock that's coming out. It really feels like that bubbling cauldron of crazy shit going on that we haven't had, I don't think, in the goth scene for a long time, really. I did want to ask about the relevance of political activism and social commentary to death rock and to your music. How you see that. I won't share any of my own thoughts, but at least yet, how do you see politics and social commentary in death rock and in the music you make?
I mean, I definitely feel that death rock culture is like more closely aligned with anarcho-punk and political activism than like, say, straight up goth culture. Closer ties to punk.
Yeah.
It's interesting, to think about like whether that like amount of political activism, if our awareness has changed over time, because like, it's just kind of hard now to like, when I want to go back and share like shit that I watched, growing up, Suburbia, and specifically Suburbia, which was back in when I first saw that in the late 80s, that movie was hugely influential to me. I was like, this is so fucking awesome. But, I recently watched that with some friends of mine who were like a lot younger than I am. Mm-hmm. And I started feeling kind of cringy and guilty that this was like, whoa, they're saying words in here that like we don't say anymore. And
yeah.
So, I think it's just that the landscape has changed and we've definitely become better people over time. And I feel that our scene is starting to reflect that. I think we've become less tolerant of shitheads in the scene. Like, and I guess we won't name names or whatever, but like, just, I feel that, like we're moving past don't be a racist to be anti-racist.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Kent, what about you? Especially maybe comparing like the music or the scene and not just the lyrics, the people that were in the scene of the 80s to what's going on now. Do you feel like political activism is like more important, less important? What do you think?
Yeah, it seems a bit more important now and much more on the surface. There's probably issues of each era that people express themselves about. But yeah, there's a lot on the surface right now, and it's a good way to express it.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of I think maybe especially in Deathrock, I don't know if I could make that, if that's completely accurate, but it seems like there are more Deathrock bands that are women or queer or people of color that are, because of that, inevitably going to lean more into political and social issues, because I think it is easier. Somebody was just talking to me about this, about how it's easier to, if you're a white dude and you're a goth, there's a lot of people in the scene that are kind of, they don't want to recognize that they have a cultural privilege because they see themselves as an outsider because they are alternative. And so it's easier for them to say that, I'm apolitical and it's not relevant, so I don't have to be, like you were saying, Adrya, anti-racist or whatever. I can, it's not important. But I think because a lot of bands now are more minority groups, and obviously when you're making music, you're drawing from your life experiences and the way that you perceive the world. That's going to be reflected in what's going on. Not to say that it was never relevant to Deathrock. I think that was always there, from like Castration Squad. That's pretty blatantly feminist commentary, and just the title alone. And Christian Death obviously had social and religious commentary and that kind of thing. Also, I don't remember which one of you mentioned it, but just culturally, outside of goth culture, that has become a much bigger issue. And I think sometimes we like to think of ourselves as our own separate little bubble, but that's just not how the world works. We're all, whether we want to admit it or not, influenced by each other in the environments we live in. So I think that's become more important and people are talking about it more. And on the positive side, like you said, not going to name names, but people have been brought to light that, like, hey, we're not going to accept this in our community because it's just hurting people that want to be part of our community, right? So
right. That's a huge improvement. And yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Trey?
I mean, you've basically echoed a
That's
lot of
fine.
my existing thoughts. I don't have a lot of new to add to that, but I agree with pretty much everything that's been said, and that it has become more prevalent these days, more out in the open. It's no longer something you can kind of dodge any longer.
Yeah.
I don't mean to sound trite, and hopefully this is not going to come across as that, but like, and death rock music is my lifeline. Like, I cannot say that I'd be on this side of the ground if I didn't have an outlet to play dark, introspective punk. Like, it's cathartic and provides me with a sense of purpose. And like, I don't know where I'd be if I didn't have this in my life right now.
Yeah. Do you find that, I mean, I don't really know how big your scene is, but have you found that you have kind of a supportive community around you? Because personally, I mean, I feel like I'm lucky that I have some really good close friends, but it can kind of sometimes, even in the goth community in a big city, can kind of feel like we have a bunch of acquaintances, right? Like we go to shows and see a bunch of people we know, but we don't have an actual support network, like people that actually care about us. I mean, I guess it's not unique to goth. It's a human life experience.
Yeah, we definitely do. I feel that, we have being trans myself, like there are definitely a lot of folks who like come to our shows who are on, the gender spectrum, non-binary or trans. There are a lot of people that aren't, just straight up cishet white dudes, and ladies and stuff, and everyone loves it. Yeah, definitely, Atlanta's got one of the biggest queer scenes in the country, and we've definitely had a lot of connection here locally with that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's important too, because at least for goth, and yeah, I mean, definitely Deathrock, especially in the 80s at least, there were a lot of sharing spaces with the queer community or the BDSM communities and that kind of thing, and I think that's continued, and I think it's even more relevant now. Like a couple bands that have been important to me as kind of finding my own queer identity, and as a non-binary person, have Adrya have been a big influence, but also like Otzi and Crimson Scarlet, or not Crimson Scarlet, sorry, Mystic Priestess. Just to like see that representation and support from coming from the music of the scene has been really fantastic, and I think that's always been there. I don't know if I've necessarily noticed it in the past, just because of my own life experiences, which I don't need to get into, but it's nice to see that diversity now. And I think that diversity also makes for interesting music. Like I was saying, it's not just musical influences, it's the people that are in the scene. If everybody's the same, you're not going to have anything interesting.
Yeah, I've just been really enjoying the rise in popularity of those same voices, the trans and queer voices, even sort of coming into popular culture with some of the new pop styles and hyper pop, and that sort of thing that's come through with some of the more niche distribution chains, like Twitter, or not Twitter, Twitch, and
Obscura Undead, like some of the record labels,
Yeah, but I've just been enjoying seeing that outlets that I would consider mainstream outlets are starting to have more representation as well, which is even more heartening than to see it only in alternative spaces.
Yeah. I mean, especially because everybody talks about, when you're talking about this kind of goth and death rock and stuff, people talk about glam and Alice Cooper and stuff, but fewer people talk about drag culture and the huge influence that like black music had on I mean, rock in general, but our music as well. And so seeing, I think, having that be recognized as important is a big deal, because it feels less appropriative, I guess, because I think it kind of was that for a long time. Anyway, I didn't really intend to get into a big political discussion, but it,
I think
it's
relevant, and I think it's good that we're talking about this and that we can talk about this, and it's not just queer people. I think there's been increased awareness in our scenes of, God, we are so white. Deathrock and Goth is so white. And I feel like it's starting to change, and that's a good thing. For instance, for me, in the 80s, when I was able to sneak a radio in my room and pick up the local college station. This is back in 1984, 85 in Athens. They had a hip hop show on, and I started, hearing Run DMC, and I don't know, Cool Mo D and things like that. And that music stuck with me. I loved the drum machines, the synthesizers, the rhythms, and I just love that so much. And I feel that has a lot to do with why, today I still play with a drum machine. That's definitely where that came from for me.
And there's a lot of really good music coming out of Latin America as well. I just watched Lord Fair of El Real Under do a Twitch live stream from Mexico, and that was amazing. He was incredible. But I mean, there's a lot of great death rock. Die of All Strain had a last minute scheduling conflict, but Causa de Muerte and Sangre de Rosas. What else was I listening to? Igor and Los Lunaticos. Are these? I mean, there's way more than that, but death rock is more than just LA and American music, right?
And last record I bought was a record by a band from Ukraine called Morwan. Fucking sick. That record is amazing. I don't understand anything they're saying, but I kind of do.
Yeah,
it's really good.
Yeah. Let's wrap up here by let me ask both of you to share where people can find your music, not just your bands, but if you have any other projects you're working on that you want to promote. Kent, do you want to share yours?
Our Alter de Fe can be found on Bandcamp. The labels of Other Voices just put out a record of all our early stuff, 85 area, before studio recordings we did, and a lot of just live recordings. Cult Whispers about before.
Oh yeah, Cult Whispers. Yeah, Desmond, right?
Yeah, but everything can be found on our Bandcamp site.
Very cool. I'll definitely make sure to link to that in the show notes, so everybody go click on that. I mean, if you haven't already bought all of Alter de Fe's albums, you should go do that. And Adrya, where can people find Tears for the Dying?
So we're also on Bandcamp. I'm there, and just released a record earlier this year on Batcave Productions out of Poland. So if any listeners are checking in from Europe, definitely hit up Batcave Productions and get our record sent to you directly from Poland.
Yeah, Batcave Productions are pretty cool as well. They do Back to the Batcave, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
They're doing our Council of Bones Batcave.
Oh, nice.
We should have the LP pretty soon.
Fantastic. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both for coming on to, I appreciate you making the time and hanging out for a little while.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Before we get into our album review and our Sinister Suggestions, I just wanted to make a quick announcement for the month of June. Until June 21st, we now have t-shirts available. It is a brand new design. I know we've done t-shirt sales a couple times in the past, and this time it's a different design than before. So if you'd like to take a look at the new design and maybe buy a shirt, there will be a link in the show notes, but you can also go to bonfire.com/cemetery-confessions, and you will that will take you directly to the t-shirt page. So if you want to grab that, you've got until June 21st, and then it will be gone again for the foreseeable future. So with that, let's get into the album review.
Album Review.
This month we are back with another album review. I know it's been a little while, but we're going to be reviewing something completely unrelated to everything else we just talked about. Although, Trey, you recommended this album, and it was good timing, I think, because we just talked last month about neoclassical and these sort of Scandinavian folk music. So we've got something in that vein. So the band we're talking about is called Garmarna.
Yeah.
And it's a Swedish folk rock band who have been around since 1990, which is amazing because I've never heard of this band before. Album is called Forbundet or something like that. Forbundet. I don't know. I don't speak Swedish.
Forbundet.
Yeah, there we go. See, if you
probably
put
also very wrong, but it sounds more authentic to somebody who doesn't speak the language.
Yeah. If you say it confidently too, it sounds right. So we're going to, let's play a song first. I'm going to play maybe the first track off of this, which is called
Ramunder.
Yep.
Och ramen steg i skeppet in, det braka i var och en naure. Och alla män som på skeppet var, det tänkte det hade förgånges. Vi förgånges icke här, sade Ramund, vi seglar lika väl, sade Ramund den unge. Så seglade över den stora sjö, allt inne på Götane lande. Och Ramund han gick lite bättre fram, där fick han se stora jätten stande. Nu är jag kommen här, sade Ramund, för utan stort besvär, sade Ramund den unge. Och käre min Ramund, du skonar mitt liv, du gör mig nu alls ingen skada. 7 tunnor guld ska jag giva dig, vi ska skina som solen den klara. Det där tar jag när jag vill, sade Ramund, du får inte leva än, sade Ramund den unge. Så seglar han över den stora sjö, allt inne på kejsarens lande. Nu är jag kommen här, sade Ramund, för utan stort besvär, sade Ramund den unge. Och Ramund han tog i dörren med kraft, så alla de murarna rämna. Och fönstren ut genom dörrarna sprang, och stenarna ramlat ihopa. Så du, jag slapp in, sade Ramund, nu gäller pälsen din, sade Ramund den unge. Och käre min Ramund, du skonar mitt liv, du gör mig nu alls ingen skada. Minst halva rike jag vill giva dig, och också min yngsta dotter. Det där tar jag när jag vill, sade Ramund, din dotter också till, sade Ramund den unge. Och Ramund han drog sitt stora svärd, det han kallade omringen dyre. Så högg han kejsarens huvud av, det rök 15 spanska mire. Jag tänkte inte nappa, sa Ramund, det nappar lika väl, sade Ramund den unge.
I will say the only thing I think the only thing I didn't like on this was in that first track, because it sounded like there was a sort of nu metal riff in there somewhere, which immediately reminded me of Queen of the Damned, because we just watched that for Patreon, and I was like, what is happening in this? It just threw me off, because I'm imagining, the rolling mountains of Sweden, and then Lestat is doing something wild on the guitar,
climbing on the walls.
Yeah. So that was a little weird, but the rest of the album I really enjoyed. I think actually track 4 sounded to me like it would fit right into a goth club night in like 2008, because it's very dancey and very similar to the type of neoclassical, neo-medieval music that was being played then, like your Helium Volas and Quintals, and it sounded more like Quintal, I think.
Well, if you noticed on their Bandcamp page, they have all the tags at the bottom. Hashtag Quintal was down there.
Is it really?
Hashtag Dead Can Dance, but yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's hilarious. I guess that's how. That's strange. I didn't realize. Oh yeah, that's right there. I guess. Oh yeah, Enya, Fawn. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I never checked those tags. I just always assumed they were genres rather than
they're usually
sound alikes.
I look down there primarily for genres just to get a feel for things, but I'm amused by what I find down there sometimes, like when I noticed it name checking other bands down there.
Yeah. But it was just interesting to me, because it reminded me of that era, and also just sort of how, Cyberpagan was talking about why that might not be as popular. And it did kind of come back in a way with this kind of music, but it is more focused on pagan type music, Celtic music, Norwegian folk music. And it's just interesting how that didn't take off in the goth scene like the neoclassical did. Because, I guess, it's more related to the romantic goth type thing, but especially in Germany, you had a very specific style of dress that it's not, I wouldn't really even call it romantic goth, because it's unique in its own way, that was very closely associated with not even neoclassical, but also just straight up, orchestral classical music. And of course, the neo-medieval thing had its own, or does have its own, subculture that sometimes gets lumped into goth just because they sort of they have their own thing at Vegete.
Yeah.
And that's, that's more historical medieval fashion. So it doesn't look at, the fashion doesn't look anything like goth, but it's just interesting to me where this type of music, I think, would probably get more associated with metal. Metal fans is sort of an offshoot of that. And Sarah and I actually do listen to a lot of folk metal and Celtic metal, like Aluvite and Brothers of Metal is a band we like a lot that's more like Norse music, Grimnir, Sirenia, Powerwolf, stuff like that. So this sounds very similar to that, except it just doesn't have the metal part, right? So when I was listening to this, rather than feeling like I needed to charge the battlefield and make my last stand, I was feeling like I wanted to run off into the woods to worship the spirits of the land and practice witchcraft in a hut somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's, it has that atmosphere that this type of music has, and I found it really engaging and enjoyable. It doesn't do anything new, but it's a pretty distinct style that there's only so much you can innovate on, but it's really polished. It's really well put together. It's catchy. The album is balanced well, I think, if you listen to it all the way through, and great production value. Basically what you would expect out of a band who's been together for so long.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was nice to discover, and I'm glad you recommended this. It's something that I'm definitely going to enjoy, and although it's not directly related to goth, or especially not death rock, I think people who listen to this podcast and are interested in tangential genres will enjoy this. So what did you think?
So in my opinion, I also like the album, though I was a little bit disappointed in it. I mean, I've been a fan of this band since the 90s, not since their inception. I didn't discover them till like their third or fourth album, when I started getting into just sort of world music and some of the folks. And I really fell in love with this Scandinavia folk blended with modern genres, whether it be rock or electronic. I really fell in love with that in the mid to late 90s. And I actually did bring this into the local goth scene down in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois.
This exact band? Or
this
that
band,
genre?
as well as another one named called Hedden and Garna. But I was DJing down there, and I was playing this. I put it in rotation, obviously, bookended by like Faith in the Muse and Dead Can Dance and other things like that, because it works very well with that sort of thing that was semi-big in the 90s. So I had a couple of tracks that I would play off of these albums, and got, some of the scene down there got pretty into it. Though we did have a lot of the scene down there that was more interested in some of the new romantic, neo-folk, worldy type stuff that this slotted into well. So I definitely did bring it in, and I've gotten some of Garmarna's, I've gotten my favorite track by them played at a couple other goth clubs just by bringing it in and saying, hey, here's a track, can you play this track? And most of the DJs have liked it. So this album was a little bit of I guess one thing I liked about Garmarn is they seem to do a little bit more experimentally stuff with their mixing of the folk elements with more modern production and modern musical elements. And that's one of the things I liked about them that makes them one of my favorites of this sort of neo-folk Nordic revival genre that I've listened to. This album was more of a step back into kind of a traditional thing, and you kind of hit the nail on the head there with your comparisons with metal. I thought this was much closer, as you said, as an offshoot of metal than something more post-punk, goth, industrial, electronic, punk type thing.
Just no chugga chugga.
Not as much as the chugga chugga, but they did have plenty of their fiddle riffs. Were doing some open fifths and stuff like that. That's very, those power chords. You're doing them on the fiddles. So, and then the drumming in a lot of, especially the first two tracks. That was actually when I first listened to them, kind of like your reaction to the first track. I didn't necessarily associate it with nu metal specifically, but both those first two tracks were like, this is, should I have recommended this? This is really more of a metal-y thing than really that goth adjacent, even though, I mean, metal isn't completely off the beaten path for goth.
Sure.
But there's oftentimes a lot of discussion within the subculture, especially within the club culture, around people recommending metal or requesting metal, and like that just doesn't get played here. That's not this kind of a scene. So there's a little bit of a tension I feel there.
It does come up. I think last Nocturna, some people in chat were talking about My Dying Bride and stuff like that. But yeah, it's very specific to a couple bands.
It is. And back when I was DJing in the 90s, I had a couple of people come in and asking to, play Lacuna Coil or something like that. I'm like, I like those bands. They're fine, but that's not the vibe we're doing here.
Yeah.
And so that's just, I was a little bit unsettled when I was listening to this, because I only kind of previewed it before I recommended it, just because it just popped up on my radar. I'm like, oh, I really like this band. They just came out with a new album last year. Let's check it out, since we were looking for something to review. So I was a little bit nervous, but track 3 came in and I was a little bit comforted a little bit more, because track 3 was actually probably the most post-punk influenced. It had a nice steady beat. It had a prominent bass line. It fell away from some of the metal thing, and it was a little bit more dancey. And then track 4, also the one that you liked from a goth dancey perspective, was similar in that vein as well. So I felt a little bit more comfortable. It did backtrack a little bit. I don't remember if it was track 5 or 6, felt like a metal ballad.
Yeah, it slowed down. Yeah.
But then I think it was either track 7 was nice, but that was very folky. So that was pretty straight up, sort of a folk ballad type thing. But track 8 and 9, I thought, capped it off the end of the record really well, with a little bit more experimental stuff, a little bit more electronic elements, and some sound design and some interesting things that they're doing along with it. So I thought that was really enjoyable. But it doesn't usurp my favorite album by them, which is Vergelnigen, which is Vengeance. That's definitely my favorite album of theirs.
Okay.
So
if you want to check that,
yeah, that was from '99.
Is that on Bandcamp? Let me see.
It is on
okay.
Pretty sure it's on Bandcamp. It's definitely on Spotify. Pretty sure it was on Bandcamp. If not, you can definitely look up at least select tracks. The title track is my favorite by far.
Okay.
On that album. That's the one I've gotten played at a couple of goth clubs. The first track I also really like. That was possibly the first one I heard, Garmarn. The thing I like about that one so much is it's got a very interesting kind of live drummed but drum and bassy kind of rhythm going on, with just the vocal line on top of it, which feels, and if you watch the video, it's great because you got the drummer like going crazy and the fast beats in the background, while the singer is just standing in the spotlight in white, stock still, just singing.
Nice. And
it's a very interesting dynamic. So that video is interesting, and you can definitely find that one on YouTube.
It's a mood, as the kids would.
It is definitely a mood.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's still definitely my favorite album. I do like their first couple of albums were a little bit more straight up folk. I think around Vengeance was when they almost became known as a folktronica band because they were adding more electronic elements. They still had a rocky edge. They weren't full on electronic. They kind of mixed a lot of elements, and then they were sort of doubling down on that in some of the later ones, which went even more into the electronic thing. But they're pretty dancey. Definitely a lot of tracks on like the 3rd, 4th, 5th album have worked well in goth clubs, at least as I've played them to the audience that I knew. So whether they would work on a general audience is, that's up to each audience and each scene to decide. But I think if people are into bands like Dead Can Dance, like Gental, or even with some of the revival now with the popularity of the Vikings TV show and Wardruna doing the soundtrack to that, I've definitely had some conversations in clubs and in tangential events with people about Scandinavian folk rock blends, and Wardruna and Garmarna and Hedningarna all come up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I enjoy the album, but a little bit disappointed in it. I felt it was losing some of the elements that make me really love this band particularly. But if you're into folk music, if you're into the Scandinavian feel, even if you're into Celtic music, I find Scandinavian music and Celtic music work very well.
Yeah.
Scandinavian music didn't go down the new age route like Celtic did in the 90s. So I feel it has more of an edge, a little bit more of that rawness that, if you go to a pub,
got more
Celtic
flutes.
Music, yeah, definitely got more flutes. A lot of mouth harp too, not in this band so much, but a lot of it has the mouth harp, which is always very interesting. But yeah, if you're into that sort of thing, or you got into Vikings and thought the music and that was amazing and want some more of it, here's a band that fits right along with that.
Excellent. All right, well, let's finish up with our Sinister Suggestions.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
Well, I did want to just mention, I think it came up in the episode, but I did want to mention the book Phantoms. I can't remember if we talked about that before we recorded or after.
I think it was mentioned during the recording.
Okay. But yeah, just it's don't know if compendium is the right word. Honestly have to look up the.
It's a lot of things. I mean, it is. I guess it is kind of a compendium in that it is a compilation or a compendium of conversations about.
Well, it's not a concise collection of information. It's
not concise.
Yeah, but it's there. There aren't very many books on Deathrock specifically. There's a photo book that came out, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now.
Which Phantoms kind of is too, though they're small photographs.
True.
But there's copious amounts of them.
And I can't remember the exact name. It was Deathrock something, but it's mostly just like big glossy images of LA death rockers. And then there's a Christian death. Well, there's the Roz Williams art book, and then there's a Christian death book that was kickstarted a year ago or something. They're supposed to be shipping the books out soon, but that's not out yet. And then there's Phantoms, which is, it's you're gonna really have to take some time to get through it because they're, like I said before we recorded, there's no editorial. I can't speak. There's no editorial voice to that. It is just a bunch of disparate interviews from over 10 years that are edited together as if you have groups of people speaking to each other. So you get a lot of, fun stories, and there is kind of a timeline that it follows, but it's, there's a lot of superfluous information, and, it's a unique experience, but it's not like a traditional, what was that book that you recommended the other day? The post Rip It Up and Start Again.
Yeah, that was I think mentioned by one of the guests, and then I also chimed in about Assimilate, which I thought was also very good. But you're right, both of those are much more. They've got a very clear authorial voice. They're concise in what they're describing about the scenes that they're talking about. Where Phantoms is definitely, it's basically an info dump of, hey, I've collected all of these conversations from the past, and let's just put it all in one giant book.
Yeah. So you get a lot of trivia, but not a whole lot more than that.
Trivia and stories, but you kind of have to read between the lines.
Yeah.
To see the whole picture about the scene developing and to put a narrative thread through it.
Yeah. But then as far as a suggestion of something I've been enjoying recently to go even further afield from what we've been talking about, I have been binging lots of sci-fi this last month.
Right.
Well, lots in comparison to how much I normally can. So Sarah's been playing Mass Effect, the Mass Effect remake, and I've been watching her play that. I've also been playing a lot of City of Ghosts, which is the expansion for Cloudpunk that I'm really enjoying.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm waiting for a new game to come out this month called The Ascent, which is like a top-down action RPG that kind of blends Mass Effect and Cyberpunk 2077. But the show I've been binging that I am just about to finish the last episode today is called Dark Matter. And it is a 2015 Canadian TV show that ran for 3 seasons until Sci-Fi canceled it, which isn't a surprise. But that's
what Sci-Fi does.
Kind of a bummer because
Siffy.
Yeah. The writers had 5 seasons basically written or at least outlined as far as the story arcs. So it works really well as like a tight narrative because you don't have filler episodes and you don't have, everything's connected in a way that makes sense. So it's really a bummer that it was canceled. But it's just, I've been depressed. A lot of people have been depressed, and it's not one of these. It's nostalgic to me in a way because it's not like a Breaking Bad or a Game of Thrones, or I think Mayor of Easttown is the big one right now. Whatever kind of like HBO drama series you get where there's a really high production value and everything is super serious. It feels more akin to the science fiction shows I watched growing up, which was like Stargate and Firefly and Farscape and that Kevin Sorbo one called Andromeda.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. So it's like a fun space adventure, and it has well-written characters. It doesn't take itself too seriously. You get the classic, like time loop episodes and time travel, and there's a heist episode. But there's also that interesting overarching story, and the world is pretty detailed. All the characters have really good chemistry. So, it's not like a gonna win an Emmy kind of show, but it's nice to have on in the background. It's not overly sad. It's not overly violent. So yeah, it's a shame that it got canceled, but it kind of got me through this month as I've been watching a lot of anime too, but it kind of got me through of like something I can enjoy that feels familiar, even though it's new and isn't going to send me into an existential crisis.
Yeah.
So I think that's my recommendation for this month.
All right. I mean, I guess I can add a couple of things in that same vein, because I've been also ironically kind of going down a bit of a sci-fi thing too, though less in watching movies and things. But I got back into some of the 4X games just recently, mostly because of the News of Humankind coming out, which has nothing to do with sci-fi. But I did play the second beta alpha, whatever the little demo thing they have on that, and enjoyed that, and started diving into a couple other games and started playing Endless Space 2, which is by the same company that does it. But it's a space sci-fi based 4X game. I also replayed. There's a free fan-made version of Master of Orion 1 called Remnants of the Precursors that I did play through as well, just to get that back in there, because Master of Orion 1 was pretty much not my first 4X. That was Civ 1, but sort of definitely my first space 4X game and sci-fi 4X game. So I don't know, maybe that was Alpha Centauri. I don't know if Alpha Centauri or Master of Orion was first, but I played both of them. But yeah, so I've been playing Endless Space 2 and been enjoying that. And then as far as the game recommendation, I haven't played it yet. It might or might not be good, and it's not coming out until next year. But it's another cyberpunk it's a tactical RPG in a cyberpunk universe called Cyber Knights. Knights is in KNI. Yeah. That looks interesting. It was I think I got into it. I was looking up other sci-fi based. I was getting into some of the space trader type games where you start with a ship and you can fight, be a pirate, or just travel from station to station, buying and selling goods to make money and expand your fleet and all that stuff.
Is that like an XCOM kind of game?
A tactical RPG would be, yeah. So Cyber Knights is going to be closer to an XCOM or Final Fantasy Tactics. If you've played down that, but XCOM's probably a little bit closer given the sci-fi setting and guns and all that, rather than the Final Fantasy setting. But yeah, those are all tactical RPGs to a degree or another.
The XCOM was a game I got into from a different streaming goth talk show called Gothic Graveyard, which totally didn't steal the idea for their name from us, but weird connection there. Excellent.
Gotta have the similar first letters.
Yeah, first letters. So as far as upcoming shows, our next Patreon, we mentioned Queen of the Damned. The next Patreon thing we're going to do is for a film, and I loosely use that term, called Interview with a Goth, which is unique in the sense that it begins with 20 or 30 minutes of footage and interviews from Wave Gotik Treffen, and then merges into a docudrama like horror film where there's a goth cult that are murdering people for Satan, which is
for Satan.
I haven't watched this since it came out in 2010, but I'm interested to see how they go from being kind and positive towards the goth scene and then falling directly into the stereotype of us being murderers. So that'll be a fun riff track. And then our episode next month is going to focus on the relevance of, or the pervasiveness of, whiteness in the goth scene and how that rears its head in pernicious ways, but also the positive movements around, as Adrya said, being anti-racist in the scene. talk about some bands and recent controversies with a panel of 3 lovely people. So that'll be our next episode.
Yeah, and not only pervasive, it's actually also, it's interesting that it's also overt. Which is both a blessing and a curse, actually. Because I've seen many people, people of color talk about how it's, I think Trevor Noah has a whole bit about it where, racism in a place like South America where they're just racist right to your face. And if they're racist, they're out about it and proud. So you know who to avoid and how to approach situations. Whereas in America, it's very simmering under the surface.
Yeah.
And it's harder to avoid and it's easier to be blindsided by.
Yeah, it ends up having to be more of a conversation because there's that sort of at least perceived plausible deniability from someone like one of my parents who is like, I don't hate black people. I love all people.
It's all about the definition.
I don't care if you're green but not see why that's, part of racism itself.
Yeah. The shield in America is the definition of the word racism.
Yeah.
That's, what is racism? Well, I'm not racist because my definition says racism is this. Well, what about this? And so that's where, but that's a conversation for that episode.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for listening. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.